Can we begin? Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Andy Smith, and I'm with NEME, or the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. You can follow us on Twitter, as you can see on your screen, at NEME Network, or on Facebook. And if you'd like to join in our efforts for creating a more just and peaceful situation in the Middle East, please email us as well. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to tomorrow. We have a Twitter hour on evangelicals against annexation, which will be at 12 p.m. Pacific time. So please follow us in that conversation tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Today, we are talking about the connections between race, militarism, policing, and annexation. And we are so fortunate today to have Sahar Vardi, who is a longtime peace activist in Israel, who works with AFSC in Jerusalem. And she served 3 prison sentences for her refusal to be conscripted in the Israeli military. So we are very excited to hear her thoughts and analysis. Instead of having a Q&A at the end, if you have questions during the conversation, just send them to me on chat, and I'll be sure to integrate them into the discussion for today in our hour together. So Sahar, thank you so much for joining us. And I was wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be where you are, like what led you to make the choice to serve these sentences, to refuse conscription. How did your analysis of militarism develop?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think that there's a lot of different things that kind of go into what makes us think the way that we do. So it's always hard to kind of really explain that process. But in many ways, I grew up kind of in what we call here in Israel a classic Zionist left house, which meant that I grew up knowing that my family was supportive of peace and that peace is kind of what we want to see in the world in the framework of a 2-state solution, but also not really knowing what the occupation was and what does it look like and what does it actually mean for people living on the other side of the same city. I grew up in Jerusalem, which is, I mean, half or 40% of the city are Palestinian who don't have the same legal rights as I do. And I had no idea. I did not know that that was happening. During the Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, with the beginning of the building of the wall, the separation wall, including in Jerusalem itself, that was kind of a beginning of a process of me of starting to unlearn a lot of the things that I was raised into. And a lot of it was just going for the first time to a Palestinian village and having this reality in which 15 minutes away in my own house in West Jerusalem, the building of the wall meant nothing to me. I didn't feel it, I didn't see it, I didn't know, it didn't have any consequences on my daily life. I could go to school, meet up with my friends, and it was all very normal. And then you make this 15-minute drive into a Palestinian village at the edge of Jerusalem, that for them, that wall separated them and everything they know, separated them from their schools, from the closest grocery store, from friends, from everything. And talking to kids my age about that, Palestinian kids in the village, they weren't worried about, 2-state solutions, 1-state occupation, whatever. They were worried about the fact that they can't invite friends over from school. Because as middle schoolers, that's really what matters. And for me, that was kind of a beginning of an understanding of what was actually happening and of the privilege that I have in that. Because again, that was not my reality. And that understanding for me, that understanding of privilege, that understanding and it's very hard to understand privilege because it's about understanding normality, right? Understanding the fact that you just go about with your life, which doesn't seem like something that you have or own or understand. But then having that mirror of understanding how it is not like that for other people because they were on color ID. That was kind of the realization process for me that also led me eventually to refuse military service, just out of an understanding that that whole system is based on the fact that people, including people who disagree with it, including people who generally are for two-state solutions and peace and against the occupation, are willing to actively participate in implementing that exact same occupation. And for me, that was kind of a thing of saying, well, that's clearly not where I want to go. And I can't be standing with Palestinians demanding their rights one day and then being literally the soldiers preventing them from those rights the next day. And in many ways, just it's an opportunity to say that, like, that is a choice that we're making, right? Being part of systems that oppress in different ways is a choice that we are asked to make, and these systems depend on the fact that we make that choice. So for me, refusing military service was a decision not to cooperate with that.
You mentioned that when you started to see things, you saw that Palestinians did not have the same rights. And of course, in the US right now, there's a lot of struggle going on, looking at the disproportionate impact of police violence, but also just racism within US society. Do you see any connections between racial politics in the US and what's happening in Israel?
Of course, I think when we talk about these things, there is the kind of technical aspect of there's different levels of what do different systems of rights look like, right? So it's very easy to, for instance, in the context of Israel-Palestine, say Palestinians in East Jerusalem legally do not have the same legal rights as I do, right? If they leave the country for more than 3 years, or the city for more than 3 years, they can't come back. They don't get to vote for the government. Like, these are very technical things that you can say, okay, that's actually a different legal system. And if you're in the West Bank, even more so, you can't enter Israel, and so on. But I think the interesting thing about it is that even in the places where it's not that question, it's not a question of how different the legal system is. So for instance, Palestinian citizens of Israel theoretically have the same rights as I do, but we know in practice that they don't. And I think that that's a lot of the similarities that we see in the US, right? If 200 years ago, 300 years ago, there was a very clear legal separation, right, of Blacks being under slavery, and you can say, okay, so you make that legal change, and then later on you can talk about Jim Crow, and you can say, okay, we're making the civil rights movement, and that there is that legal change, but it doesn't actually create equality by definition, because racism and systems of oppression can manifest in so many different ways. And I think policing is a very clear way to show what that looks like. So obviously I don't need to tell you all what that looks like in the US, and the incarceration rates of especially African Americans, but generally people of color in the US, which is obviously a lot of what's happening right now in sense of protest. But if we take it here, you'll see the same thing. If I'm only talking about citizens of Israel, so disregarding for a moment Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, then about 3/3 of the prisoners in Israel are Palestinians. If we talk about minors, we're talking about over 50% of the prisoners inside Israel are Palestinian or Arab. That's obviously a racial system. I do want to say that it's not just a racial system, and like in the US, it's not only about African Americans. Here, it's not only about Palestinians. So for instance, Ethiopian Jews, who make for 2% of the population of Israel, make for close to 20% of incarcerated youth, of juvenile detention in this country. That is a pretty crazy ratio. And I think we all kind of assume that children don't get born a certain way into that they're gonna develop into going to prison and become criminals just because that's the way it is, right? We know that there's a system that incarcerates people of color more, that detains to begin with people of color more, and an entire tracking system of how the education system works and lack of resources and things like that, that all feed into all of these things. So there's a lot of parallels to make. I do think that just speaking now, it is very important to say that 3 days after George Floyd was killed, Iyad al-Halak, a Palestinian from East Jerusalem, 32-year-old with mental disabilities, was shot dead by Israeli border police. And it is very clear that the reason that they shot him is because they are trained to shoot Palestinians, to shoot first and ask questions later, because Palestinians are by definition a threat. And that is very much the parallel that happens in the US of saying, Black men are by definition a threat. Use violence first, ask questions later. And I think that those parallels are screaming.
You were mentioning kind of the targeting of somebody with a psychiatric disability, and in the US, the majority of people shot by the police have a disability. Do you see, so there is a nexus of race and ableism that's leading to vulnerability to police violence. Do you see similar things happening in Israel?
For sure. I think one of the things that happens is that I was talking to quite a lot of Palestinian friends about this, and I've actually had these conversations with Black friends in the US as well in the past. But what happens is that when you grow up in a system like that, where police is by definition going to see you as a risk, you need to learn certain things, right? You need to learn how to not look suspicious and how to like make sure that they can't accidentally think that you're doing something that you might not. Like you have this whole set of rules around you that is huge, and you're constantly living and breathing it. And yes, people with different levels of mental disabilities, that's going to be harder for them. It's not because, like, it's not actually just around the ableism. It's around the fact that we kind of, as societies, expect people of color to be that level of aware of everything that's happening all the time. And I think that intersection, as you say, is a crucial one. It was actually very, in some ways, it was inspiring to see that there was a lot of protest happening here after the killing of Iyad, and like a lot of media around it. Even the equivalent here of the Minister of Police, said something about it, wanted to visit the family after. Like there was, and this is a very right-wing politician, so there was like reaction to it. But the reaction to it was only because in this incident, it happened to be someone with a disability. And that if it would be any other Palestinian, we would just take that as for granted, almost as they deserved it, right? And in this specific case, it's hard to make that argument. But I do think that it is important to remember that while that intersection is definitely there, it is fundamentally about racism.
Well, and racism is often structured through disability, right? Like people of color are imaged as inherently lacking in full mental capacities, et cetera, right? Like that's often used to justify gender and racial oppression. And also it seems like you're mentioning too, when we talk about police violence, there's a tendency to separate good or deserving victims versus undeserving victims. So if somebody's criminalized, then their right to life somehow disappears. Is this something you see happening? And also particularly in terms of how this racial violence in Israel is linked to the occupation?
Yeah, so I think that there's two levels. I mean, obviously, yes, we have the same kind of, again, criminalization of populations as a way to justify, but the kind of specific nuance that it has here, while with, I would say, for instance, with Ethiopian Jews, it's very much the parallel that you see in the US. The specific nuance that we have here with Palestinians is obviously the kind of terrorist threat. And it is important to say that this means that we're not just talking about police violence, actually. We're talking about something much wider. We're talking about military, which in the US at least is not something you'll see, I know now specifically a little bit more, but generally you don't exactly see boots on the ground. But here that is very much intertwined. It means that there is a hybrid unit of military and police. So these are soldiers who have the authorities of police officers, but are soldiers, conscript soldiers, who are specifically designated to police Palestinians. So there's a lot of like structural aspects of it, and including security guards, private citizens who are literally encouraged by Israeli politicians to get licenses to guns in order to walk the streets and solve that or treat that threat, right? There's this idea that there's constantly a Palestinian threat happening on the streets 24/7, and even citizens, civilians, are expected to be armed to be ready to respond to that, to shoot, right? Which is obviously a crazy situation. But it's very much normalized here. And as you say, it's justified because in people's narratives, by this idea that, yeah, I mean, it's either us or them, right? There's going to be an attack. And so we see things, again, like the killing of Iyad now would have been socially justified if it wasn't specifically for his specific case, but in any other case, it would have been socially justified because, okay, Palestinian is a threat. By definition, it's what he is. And I think, yeah, that's definitely some things that we see there. When we do need to think about what are the consequences of the occupation, not only on Palestinians, but more widely, but because when you have a system that's so much built on, on fear on the one hand, and on the other hand, on this idea that police and military will always be sacred to a degree, because they are protecting us from this crazy threat, of existential threat, then what they do becomes legitimate, not just towards Palestinians, but again, also towards Ethiopian, Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arab countries, and kind of the different levels of how racism works within Israel. It's also, so I mean, the occupation doesn't end at the green line, right? If you have a society that's willing to accept that behavior, it's not going to stop accepting it when it's in its backyard. And I think that we see that on so many different levels of how racism is being normalized within Israeli society.
Well, what you're saying is making me think of when you talk about police violence being framed as opposing not just a domestic threat, but a terrorist threat, and how now you're hearing the protesters in the U.S. being described as terrorists now by the current administration. I was wondering, maybe could you expand more in terms of, especially the U.S., we often think of militarism as something out there, although now we're seeing it here more. We were at one student gathering and we got surrounded by the National Guard, so it's starting to come home a little more in this current context. But can you say a little bit more about how you see militarism impacting not just Palestinians, but also Israeli society, generally speaking?
Sure. I mean, I will start just by saying that even in the US context, I mean, not that the use of terrorism is a new thing. I think Angela Davis was a terrorist as well, wasn't she? Like these terms have been used for decades, but also that
but not the KKK, right? They never designate white supremacist groups as terrorist groups.
That goes back to what makes a terrorist. And yeah, as you say, a color of a skin is much more relevant than actions in a lot of the discourse. And again, the same goes to U.S. police militarization. That's not new either. You have the what's it called 1033, the program that gives Army surplus to police stations, literally because it's cheaper than finding storage for it by the military. Like, there are some pretty crazy reasonings for some of the militarization in the U.S. But I think that the interesting thing here is that it's actually very hard for us to talk about a kind of increased militarization process or militarization of police, because the state in its essence is so militarized that doesn't even feel like a very relevant conversation of kind of a process, right? Literally the first thing that happened with the creation of the state was the creation of its military. It's the first law that was put in place. Conscription has been since the creation of the state until today. So people also carry that individual kind of militaristic aspect to it. There's just so much. The Israeli military is the most trusted institution in the country and always has been. But it's not just a military. There's a kind of civilian branch of it. So now with, for instance, with COVID, and the response to COVID, the part of the state that was responsible for actually implementing the civilian response to it was the military kind of home front, right? They're the ones who like the whole state is already created around such a militarized concept that I think that that's one of the things that differs us a bit from the conversations happening now in the US about kind of militarization, what that looks like increasingly. And again, if we do bring it back to the occupation, I think it is important to say for Palestinians, there are none of these divisions, right? They see soldiers, police officers, border police, which is this hybrid unit, and it's all acting exactly the same as far as they're concerned.
We have a question from an audience member wanting to know, what support network do Israeli refuseniks have?
Well, with a highly militarized society, it's not always easy, obviously, for those who do choose to not serve in the military, but it also means that we do have kind of a lot of people involved in wanting to support. So I can say, for instance, there's a group called Misalvot. I can write it in the chat later, but that is a group that supports young Israelis who are refusing military service. So at the moment, there's a group of 17 to 18-year-olds who are writing together a refusal letter. This happens once every few years. So they're kind of being escorted. We help them explain to them a little bit how things are going to look like. And it's really inspiring to see how much these youth are obviously doing something that most of their society does not agree with, their parents usually don't agree with, but are doing so much work around it. They just initiated a letter again of Youth Against Annexation that has over 300 people, high schoolers who signed it, and they're organizing a protest tomorrow about it. And it's really kind of inspiring to see how many people are active on it. So locally, those are the main groups. In the US, I would refer you to an organization called Refuser Solidarity Network, which tries to kind of consolidate some of the support from the US on issues of refusal here.
Kind of building on that, it seems what's interesting in the US is, as you mentioned, the military and police are institutions you generally can't question, right? They're saving us from horrible things. But now, right, we have a movement in which people are actually talking about policing abolition, and people are defunding the police, which was seemed unheard of, like even a month ago. So what, do you see any parallel or possibilities of delegitimizing, does that make sense, the military is something you can critique, or the police you can critique in Israel, and what is needed or what can be done to further that?
Well, my initial response would be I can't see it, but I have to say that, you know, speaking to activists in the US, you'd ask them 6 months ago if they would be able to actually seriously have a campaign around defunding the police and feel like it might actually work, they would also say no. So that's the good news, is that we never actually know when the tides are changing on these things. But I will say that in the case of Israel, with the military, I can't even think of that happening. With the police, I think there's a little bit more opening, and there are a lot of attempts to kind of bring together different forms of police violence, racialized police violence, and kind of present that. And there's a bit more understanding of that. But still, the biggest protest that we had now with the killing of Iyad was about 300, maybe 350 people. If you obviously compare that to what's happening right now in the US, we're not there at this point, unfortunately. I do hope that will change. And I think it's also a question of how, and I mean, for instance, questions like defunding can happen in the US, can be a conversation in the US because your police system is localized. And that's actually a conversation that just technically can't happen here, right? Like the question here of defunding and abolition is actually the exact same thing, because it's one federal government paying for it, and like it would actually mean the same thing. So we also need to understand what are the local languages that actually make sense when we talk about kind of police reform, abolition, defunding. All of these things are really a question of where you are at and what does that mean in your local context. Just a few hours ago, I was on a webinar on this issue and spoke to a few people, similar voices, both from Indonesia, but also from Kenya and Zimbabwe, that were all saying, well, we don't actually want to talk about defunding police in our own context because they're so badly funded that it becomes a privately owned thing that people just bribe to control. And so there's kind of, it's just because it's a different discourse. And defunding the police is a really relevant and important discourse in the structure that exists right now in the US. But in different places, we need to be thinking about different languages and what is the structural change that needs to happen to really be able to stop police oppression.
I also understand that the police in the U.S. are often trained by Israeli military personnel. Is that true? And how did these connections develop?
So Israeli and U.S. military relations have quite a history and are very well kind of structured in a lot of agreements and the U.S. military aid to Israel. But specifically when we talk about police training, for the most part, what you would have is U.S. police training either with Israeli border police, which is this hybrid unit that I was talking about, that is half police, half military. So usually US police officers will not come to train with the Israeli army, right? That looks bad. But instead they can train with this hybrid thing, which is exactly the same. But you can technically say this is a police to police exchange, right? But this is a unit that literally what they were created for is to control Palestinian civilian population, which I'll just translate that into military terms for a moment. That means controlling civilian enemy population. That is what they were created for. That is what they know how to do. That is what they are then training their US counterparts in, how to control a civilian enemy population. We know that the St. Louis police was trained in Israel just in the beginning of 2014, just before Ferguson happened. We can assume that at least some of the tactics that were used there was exactly that, right? A police that switches their mindset into a place of we are now controlling a civilian enemy population, whatever that takes. And that keeps happening. I also don't want to, like, those trainings are happening, they have a huge effect, they have an ideological effect when you kind of train that way, but I also don't want to just blame the Israeli militarization. I mean, what's happening in the US has to do with US racism and militarism just the same, and there's quite a history of that oppression by police from where police was created in the US around slavery to today, that I do think, I mean, again, these trainings are happening, we need to be noticing them, we need to talk about these exchanges and we tactically see how they affect protests, but to also remember that the actual root ideology behind it, that's been there far before Israel and will probably remain far after.
So we have a question for you around annexation, but before we ask that question, I'll probably ask a more general question, which is, can you tell us a little bit, given kind of your analysis of what's going on around race, militarism, policing in Israel, how does that connect to this kind of current push for annexation in Israel? Like, what's motivating that and what is the significance of that?
Well, I think that the push for annexation, it's an interesting conversation in Israel, kind of the pro and against annexation, because both sides of that argument, for the most part, except the really margins of the left, but for the most part, both sides of that argument come from a racist start point. On the one hand, you have the right wing saying we should be annexing. And when we say annex, we don't mean the people, we mean the land. We don't want Palestinians into that. Palestinians should not get rights when they're being annexed, should not become equal citizens when they're being annexed. Like, that's one side of the discourse that obviously makes very clear separation between Palestinians and Israelis and comes from a very racist perspective. But also a lot of the more mainstream opposition to annexation comes with the idea of saying annexation will destroy the two-state solution. And if we destroy the two-state solution, we destroy our chance to separate from the Palestinians. And that is usually often the term that is used, right? We don't want annexation because we want a Palestinian state to be created over there in Gaza and the West Bank so we can separate, so we can step away from this. And that's not necessarily less racist. It's different, it has different manifestations, but it still comes from this basic idea that we do not want to live with Palestinians. But that is not the goal here. And I think that for me, that is a very interesting thing in this whole conversation about annexation, how much for actually the more radical left, but also for a lot of Palestinians, that discourse just seems so distant. I mean, we're very happy to talk about and to object to what annexation will actually mean on the ground, and there's a lot of consequences to it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it soon. But the actual concept of it isn't actually that different than what's already happening. And I think that's kind of important to really center that and disconnect it from a racist, or disconnect the objection to annexation from a racist discourse.
So that actually speaks to the question that came from the audience, which was, like, what do we do when, like, you're trying to win, like maybe you're trying to oppose annexation, but people end up doing it based on the same racialized policies that you think you're opposing. Do you think the Israeli government will be amenable to such arguments? And if they are, do you want to do them? Does that make sense? Like, in other words, do you think Netanyahu would be amenable to not doing annexation because it would make Israel less safe? Would that be compelling? And if it was compelling, would we want to make that argument given its racializing assumptions?
I think one of the things that the Israeli kind of traditional Zionist left, or that camp, one of the things that they've actually proved very well is that attempt fails. That if we are actually, if the left actually comes from just as much as a racist perspective, only giving a little bit of a different solution to what it looks like, the right-wing solution might actually be better at that. They're better at being racist than the left is. And it works better. And I think that is the fact that the Israeli Zionist left doesn't exist today, like literally just collapsed politically completely, is because it didn't really have something else to offer, because it was offering another version of what the right wing is offering, just not as assertive about it. And I think that that's actually an opportunity for an actual left to come from an anti-racist discourse. But specifically about the annexation, I think it is important to say, with the current government that we have, that is a huge government, it's a unity government of the so-called center party together with the right party. Honestly, public opinion about anything almost doesn't matter. And that's a very sad thing to say right now, but that is the political situation we are currently in. And annexation is on the bottom of the priority of Israeli discourse. Nobody cares about it here. People are much more interested, obviously on kind of a daily basis, on how do we economically survive COVID, now with the second wave of COVID, how does that affect people? When people are more critical, there's a lot of conversation about kind of the emergency laws that the state is using, surveillance against citizens, all these kind of things that are important. But they are dominating Israeli discourse, and the annexation is just not fair. So I think whatever discourse we use is not about trying to convince Israeli public at the moment. It's just not going to work. I think what is very clear on kind of objecting or protesting annexation is that for you guys as a US perspective, annexation can and will not happen without US support. And that's been very clear, and the only reason that it's now on the table is because of the Trump deal of the century. And to be honest, right now with everything happening in the US, this might not be Trump's priority, which is a good place and time to kind of pressure that and say, well, this is not where Americans want this to go either. So I think that that's actually a place where you have much more power, and there the discourse is less. Like the nuances of the discourse don't matter as much. I do think it's important, obviously, for people who are against racism and are like, that is part of their ideology, to always speak from a perspective that is an anti-racist perspective and not fall into other places. But the nuances of that in the US will really just come down to, is the US supporting annexation, yes or no? And I think that is kind of an important thing. The other pressure point is obviously the pressure point in Europe, and that is actually moving a bit more. There was a meeting of all the foreign ministers in Europe to specifically discuss what kind of sanctions will be put in place if Israel does annex. So that is kind of moving ahead, and I think the US voice is really the one that we need to be working on.
It's interesting your point of there's no point in trying to out racist the rights, right? So the thing you think is going to appeal to people doesn't usually work. And I think it's I feel like that's kind of happening in the US. Like I think we're seeing the change from people switching their tactics to saying we're not going to appeal, we're not going to use these reformist things we know that don't work. We're actually going to say this is what we think would be a better way to ensure public safety, generally speaking. And then ironically, that's pushed even simpler reforms much faster than has happened with all the safer things people were arguing for before that didn't do anything. So it's interesting to think about, like, even if you feel outnumbered, what would it mean to just stand for what you actually believe in rather than trying to outguess what somebody who's supporting retro policies will like. But you had alluded to before that, on one hand, you were saying that annexation is kind of de facto happening now, but then you said that there would be impacts of kind of a formal annexation. Can you say what those effects would be and why they should be a concern?
I will start by saying that the entire discourse about annexation is a big guessing game because right now there is no plan. We don't have an actual plan to refer to and really understand what it means. But what we do know, or what we can assume, is that whatever pieces of the West Bank are annexed into Israel, it'll probably be a slow process, and it'll probably be big settlements first and so on. But together with all of that, what will definitely happen at some point with this annexation is, first of all, annexation of lands that are not don't currently have settlements built on them. If that's the kind of areas around settlements that are their municipal border, which is much wider than the actual settlement, if that is the roads leading to them and the areas around that, there is going to be land that is currently Palestinian cultivated, and most of the areas we're talking about are agricultural areas. So land that is currently Palestinian cultivated, owned, that will be annexed in this annexation. It is very clear that whatever annexation looks like, that will be one of the things. Legally speaking, we have a precedent of what annexation looks like. East Jerusalem was annexed in ~67, so we know exactly what Israeli law translates into when that annexation happens. And what it translates into is that those lands that are annexed without their owners, right? Their owners stay in the West Bank and unannexed areas. Those lands become, under Israeli law, absentee property. We don't need to get into the technicalities of what that means, but it means that they just move into the hands of the state. And so that's one way of just taking over a lot of lands within the Israeli legal system that annexation will do almost automatically. Another aspect of that is the Palestinians who will be annexed, and the assumption is that some Palestinians from more rural communities will be on that land that is annexed. Then what happens with them? And again, the assumption, and as we saw in the case of East Jerusalem, is that they will receive residency status, which is, again, not citizenship. It's a lot like a green card. So you can live and work and things of the sort, get Social Security, but not only can you not vote, but if you leave the country, you lose this, meaning you lose the right to go back to where you are from. Right? So these are very practical things that we just know are going to happen in any form of annexation. The same goes for the water. Water in the areas that are annexed, and there's already maps kind of going around that it looks like that the areas that will be annexed are on some of the best parts of the aquifer, the water aquifers of the West Bank. So that water will already be annexed. So there's all these kind of different aspects of what will it actually mean practically on people's lives that are extremely worrying. There's still an occupation going on now. Like, also now, lands are being confiscated and water is being confiscated and Palestinians do not have their rights. It's just one more layer of it.
What do you suggest that people in the U.S., particularly people of faith, evangelicals, who are often supporting annexation, so what are things, what do you think we can do to oppose annexation here, or that we can best be effective in addressing this crisis, which is actually in a certain way not a crisis, as you're mentioning, it's part of the normalization. So how do we also denormalize occupation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I will always say these are questions that are much better asked back to you in the U.S., and that's kind of that's the homework for all of you. But I will say, I mean, first of all, it is important again to say we are in a Trump administration, which also means that right now, really Trump's only political interest in pushing this forward is the evangelical community. There isn't right now on the table another substantial political interest for him to push this forward. And that's obviously a lot of work. And I've had a chance with Churches for Middle East Peace and others to visit in evangelical communities. And there's a lot, like my experience of that was mostly that there's a lot of ignorance. People don't know. And actually, when you talk to them about it, when you start to explain what's actually happening, it shatters a lot of this idea that they have about Zion and Jerusalem that is a very biblical idea that just has nothing to do with reality today, and really just from a place of not knowing. And I think that that is an important, really important audience. I will also say that I think that many times it's not necessarily about convincing people to become advocates for Palestinians right now or things like that. That's like, could be a lot to ask, and there's a lot to do in the US, but many times it's just asking people to shift from a place of blind support to Israel, of saying, wait, maybe there are some problems and we should just take a step back and actually understand this before we react to it. And I think that even that step would probably be enough. For instance, for the Trump administration to say, well, this is not in our interest. We don't need this right now. So that's as far as kind of more the evangelical community goes. But I think more broadly in the US and the faith community, there's a lot to do in talking to members of Congress, and in talking to senators about that there are sign-on letters that some members of Congress have already signed on to. Unfortunately, this is very much seen as a partisan issue, and I think that that needs to break. Unlike a lot of other issues, there's no reason why something that is clearly against international law and not necessarily in the interest of the US generally needs to be a partisan issue. And so speaking to more and more Congress people around this, I think is also very helpful from the US perspective.
Yeah, what you're saying coincides with what I've seen. Is on the one hand, there's so much evangelical support that has no critical engagement with Israel's policies, but it's so often based on just lacking facts. And I've been so many times where a room with people just very uncritically supporting Israel, and then one person talks for 15 minutes and everybody changes their mind just because the basic insertion of information can be transformation. But I think that just speaks to anyone watching this, fellow evangelicals. We just need to start having these conversations and just open up possibilities to think about this, because I think when people start to see, then people see something else needs to happen for everyone. Kind of along those lines, when we're thinking about kind of the struggles going on in Israel and Palestine, and also what's happening in the U.S., it makes me think of how in the civil rights movement, one thing that made it successful was that it wasn't just a domestic struggle, but it became a global struggle. And government officials were afraid of being embarrassed. They didn't want to be embarrassed on the global scale. And it was the global pressure that really led to a lot of civil rights litigation getting passed. And a lot of times when we think of these things, we tend to focus only on the local, when it's the global that actually often enables a local struggle to be successful. So in that context, I was wondering, what do you see as the possibilities of maybe what already exists, but also what could be, and developing more global relationships between those seeking racial justice and an anti-militarism in the U.S. and in Israel?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that that's a really important thing to kind of emphasize. And we usually think about it in the context of Israel-Palestine from a very kind of high-level political. So again, what will the Trump administration allow or not, and how will the European diplomat respond to that? And that is in many ways very disconnected from us, right? From the conversations that we can actually have. And so I think that one of the things that's kind of really important, and you talked about in this connection to the people actually resisting, is creating those ties of solidarity with people who are fighting for social justice and racial justice in different places. And I think it's important to say it's not just creating them because we come from the same ideological background and kind of want the same thing, fighting racism, which is important to create that solidarity, but also because we actually do have very clearly common interests here. And it's anything from, there's a campaign led by, I think, War Resisters League in the US that talks about tear gas and looks at where does US manufactured tear gas oppress protests in the US, and where does it do it oppressing protests here against Palestinians and other places in the world, and kind of actually looking at how much of the mechanisms themselves are shared, and therefore how much of our resistance makes sense to be shared. So for instance, campaigning against tear gas companies that sell their tear gas to oppress all these different communities is something we can actually do together and have far more power around that. Practically speaking, it was very clear, again, in Ferguson in 2014, that Palestinian activists were tweeting to their counterparts in Ferguson how to deal with the tear gas because it's the same company and they have all these experiences and there's like practical tools we can learn. So if the police go to train each other on tactics, we might as well do the same on kind of how to deal with those tactics. And it really builds a lot of ties. I can tell you that one of the more successful stories that we had in this context was working with activists in Mexico, where Israeli surveillance and spyware software was used against activists there, journalists there for a very long time, and making those connections about how this software is developed to be used against Palestinians and then used in Mexico against different citizens. And it was really kind of a large conversation that ended with the new, not new anymore, administration in Mexico actually deciding to cut relations with those companies and not use that kind of spyware anymore. So I think that there's a lot of kind of potential, and how do we really open that comes from a place of saying we have a common interest here.
Also, what I was thinking about, and I think you raised a very important point, is that kind of what words or slogans or our campaign theme is, what works in one context doesn't necessarily work in another context. And nowadays in the US, we've got defunding the police, we have abolition, we have reform, we got a lot of different words, and then even within each word, nobody agrees what that means. But one thing I'm kind of liking about abolition amongst some folks is that they describe abolition as not a negation, but it's a presence. In other words, it's not about getting rid of the police or whatever, but it's about creating the thing you want instead. It's like, what is a society we would need to create such that the prison industrial complex wouldn't even need to be there? So it kind of sparks a sense of creativity of what does real public safety look like? What does peace actually look like? And what structures do we need to create to make those things happen? And how can we be in that place of imagination? So I was just wondering, for you and all the work that you've done for so many years, like, what is your imagination or the collective imagination you're excited about, and what you would like to see in Israel and Palestine?
Political imagination is a great tool, and it's one of the more fun tools of activism. And I think that for me as a Muslimite, it's actually really easy to kind of see what could be here differently. Jerusalem, in many ways, I would say, is at least 3 different cities. You have a Palestinian Jerusalem, you have ultra-Orthodox Jewish Jerusalem, and you have a non-Orthodox or secular Jewish Jerusalem. In many ways, they function as 3 cities. They're different public transportation system, languages, education systems, everything. And I think that in many ways, the fact that they actually manage to function, for me, is kind of a model of what things could look like if we just add onto that also actual equality. So the problem with it now is, again, the 40% of the city that are Palestinians don't have equal rights. The policing will be policed against them and against ultra-Orthodox in a very different way than it would be against me. But the very concept of very different communities being able to live in the same city and create their own cultural systems and create their own structures, and that's fine. What we need to not do in that is the systematic aspects of it that in many ways are probably the easiest to dismantle, right? They need to have, we need the police to not work as it does, but those are all systems. that in many ways are much easier to change, and allowing people to stay within a community and within the values of the community that they want to, but in a way that doesn't have to be at the expense of others' communities. And I think that that's a lot. I think that many times when we talk about kind of dealing with white privilege and things of the sort, there's always creation of this kind of zero-sum game that mainly says, well, if we want to deal with white privilege, what it means is that for whites to lose privilege. Well, actually, you're saying, well, we want to dismantle the system of privilege, but what it actually means is for people of color to have rights and have the ability and life that we all kind of aspire to. And that's actually a common goal that we should have, because all of our communities will be much better that way. So I think that for me, kind of that is the ideal of what things can look like. But there's a lot of structural issues to deal with on the way, and we never know what is that moment, that tidal wave moment that really starts shifting those. And as you say, we need to be ready for that moment with the ideas like the activists right now in Minneapolis are dealing with. We're saying, okay, great, so there's going to be a reform. Let's start like an actual from the ground up rebuilding. Let's talk about what that looks like, and that can actually be extremely exciting.
What you're saying is so exciting to me, because in my context around Indigenous liberation, I think not, of course, many peoples don't all agree on all things, but a similar kind of vision I've seen articulated, particularly in Latin America. When I was at the World Social Forum, the Indigenous peoples there were saying that the issue they want to distinguish is nations from nation states. That we tend to think the goal of the liberation struggle is a nation state that's exclusivist, right? You know, you're in, we're in, you're out, right? And instead, and it's based on kind of a sense of self that's exclusive, right? Like, I know who I am because I'm not you. And so they talked about decolonization is not about saying everyone else goes home. Instead, they said it's about fundamentally understanding ourselves differently, as that we exist because of everyone else. And as a result, our nations are not exclusivist, but they're fundamentally connected to all other nations. And any nation cannot do well if other nations are not also thriving. So it's not about then exclusivist control of land, right? They said that in fact, colonization is about changing land from being a relative that we are responsible for and we must care for and that we are connected to an object that one group can control and own. And so what would it mean to kind of switch our orientation to see that land is not something that anybody gets to just own, but that we must all be in relationship to it. And that might create a different sense of what liberation can be, such that liberation doesn't have to be kind of a zero-sum game. Well, we're starting to get near the end, but I was wondering, is there any kind of last thoughts, like things you feel, what lessons we in the US can learn from the work being done in Israel, or vice versa, or kind of any things that we have not covered that you feel it's important that folks should know about?
Well, I will just say that it is extremely inspiring for us over here to kind of see what's happening in the US and see that discourse, and see what we can learn and take from it. But also kind of an open invitation to say that, like, I know that in many other cases, we've also, but like sharing tactics, sharing ideas, sharing these things really enriches all of us and kind of allows us all to grow. As I was saying before, I was on a webinar earlier today where we were just exchanging different ways of how do we, for instance, protest now under COVID with social restrictions, and anything from projecting giant Zoom protests onto buildings, to using cars, to like just the fact that we can exchange ideas, both on how to resist oppression that exists today, but also on what alternatives we're building, for me is extremely inspiring. And I think it would be great to always continue those conversations. And I'd love to hear more from you, Andy, and generally from people, and kind of how we move this forward together.
For people who might want to continue to be in conversation with you, is there a way they can connect with you after this webinar?
Sure.
Or you may just have too many things to do, but I don't want to put pressure on you, but is there a way
please.
for that?
I would love to. So Yeah, so I work for the American Friends Service Committee, and if you go to their Israel page, so if you write afsc.org/Israel, then you will find my contact information, and I'm really happy to be in conversation about this.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and everyone listening. And of course, these are ideas that are controversial, people disagree with, especially in evangelical communities. And I think that's okay, but I think the issue is, can we open up a conversation? Can we entertain possibilities even if we don't agree with them? Can we just imagine some other possibility? And sometimes an idea that seems ridiculous now, there might be some seeds of it that present a different possibility we haven't even thought about in the future. So at NEME, we're kind of here to create the space to disagree, debate, but also imagine something else. So if you're interested, please continue to be in contact with NEME either on Twitter. I think the email address is on the Zoom chat, and we also have a Facebook page. And of course, please do join us tomorrow if you're able during our Twitter Power Hour, in which we will have a conversation on evangelicals against annexation. And again, you can find that on our Twitter handle. So any last words, Sahar, before we sign off for today?
No, just thank you, Annie. It was a very interesting conversation. I'm really glad I could be here.
Well, thank you. It's been fabulous. Well, I met you once and we had the trip to Israel and Palestine, and you were brilliant then and you're still brilliant now. So it was great to talk to you again, and hope for continuing conversations. And everyone else, I hope we can continue to work together to see what we can bring about for a different kind of world that's more peaceful and just for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. We're not streaming anymore.
So.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.